In today's episode of the Simulator series, we are going to be scripting the trading system. And as always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, let's get into it. We're first going to start off by scripting the button. So inside of the trade menu GUI, we're going to open up the button script right here. And now for the settings button variable, we're going to change around the buttons GUI.left buttons holder, and then we can get the trade button right from there. And of course, we'll rename this variable from settings button to trade button. And now that's all done, this will open up the trade menu GUI so that you can send requests to other players for trading. The next thing we'll be scripting is the trade menu. What we're going to do is we're actually going to delete the button and handler script, and then we're going to go directly into the manager script and start cleaning this up a little bit. First of all, we don't need that settings variable, and we don't need the exit variable neither. We can also delete this for loop and this exit mouse button one click right there, and this is all good. Now we'll start modifying the on and off color variable that we have, and what we're actually going to be changing them to is this little button right here. So the background color for this button right here. Because remember, whenever we send out a trade request to a player, we want to modify this button to say pending and have a purple background color, but if it's not pending, then we want it to be green and have the text send on it. So we'll rename the first variable from on color to send underscore color, and then from off color to pending color. Now the pending color is not going to be red, it's actually going to be a purple, so something like that. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to rename the generate setting function to generate player, and instead of accepting a setting, which is going to be a table, it'll actually accept a player, which is of course a player. Now let's go inside of the frame, inside of the container, and inside of the template right here so that we can see all the components it has. And what we're going to do is we're just going to delete most of the stuff in this function right here besides cloning and then also parenting it to the container. Next, what we're going to do is we are going to set the clone.name to the player.userID so that we can easily identify this template. Then what we want to do is we want to modify the player, which is actually a text label. So we're going to set the text of the player text label to the player.displayName. Next, inside of the clone, we have the avatar, which is an image label. And we're actually going to set this image to a thumbnail of the player, which Roblox will actually provide for us. So the way that we get this is by using the player service, and then we call a method called getUserThumbnailAsync, and what we need to pass through here is the player's user ID. And then we also need to pass through an enum.thumbnailType so that we have to say the type of thumbnail that we want, and we actually want the headshot for this. And we also have to pass through a thumbnail size to this as well. And for this, because it is relatively small, we'll probably want a 48 by 48, but if you want something larger, you can request that as well. And then we also need to make sure that the visibility is set to true so we can actually see this. And then we need to listen for whenever the button on this is actually clicked. So clone.button.mousebutton1 click and connect that to an anonymous function. Now let's consider when we actually want to call this function. We want to call this function whenever a player joins the game or leaves the game, but also when we first join the game, we also need to get all the players that are in our game currently, and we need to generate a template for them. So we can first start off by using a for loop, and we can say for_player in iPairs players get children do. And all we have to do is call the generate player function and pass through the player. And we also want to do this whenever a player is added to the game. So players.player added connect function player, and then we're just going to call the function once again and pass through the player. Now whenever a player leaves the game, we actually want to delete the template. So players.player removing connect function player, and now we need to remove it from the container. So the way we can do this is by saying local player template equals container find first child player.userID. If we find that template, then what we'll do is we'll say player template destroy, and I spelled that wrong. But there we go. Now, one thing is that we already have a variable called player in lowercase. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to rename that variable from player to local player so that we have no confusion with this variable right here and the variable called player inside of our other functions as well. Now, the only time that we actually really need to use the local player is when we call this function. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if player equals local player, then return end. And the reason that we're doing that is because we don't want to actually generate a template for our own player, because obviously we can't trade with ourselves. So whenever this function is called, if it is our player, then we don't want to generate anything, so we'll just return. Otherwise, it'll generate a template for whatever player we pass through to here. Now, whenever the button is clicked inside of the template, we want to actually do something. And what we want to do is we want to send a request to another player to see if they would like to trade with us. Now, the way we're going to do this is by actually using a remote function. So let's go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, and create a new remote function. This remote function is going to be called send trade request. And then inside of where we're listening for the mouse button one click, we're going to create a new variable called result, and we're going to set that equal to the remotes.send trade request invoke server. And now the argument that we're going to pass through to here is the player.userID. And remember, this is referring to the player whose template this is, not our own player. Now, the only possible result that we're ever going to get back from this is either true or false. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if result then, and now we want to do something if there is a result. What we want to do is we want to set the button, so the button that we're listening to right now, we want want to actually set the background color 3 to the pending color, and we want to modify the text of the button as well. So button.text equals pending. And now this is basically going to tell our player that the player we sent the trade request to is currently on cooldown. So while it's pending, we have to wait and we cannot send another invite. So then what we're going to do is we're going to say task.delay. And this is basically going to say in 30 seconds, reset this button so it no longer displays a cooldown. Now for the duration, you can obviously pick however long you want players to have a trade request cooldown for. I'm just going to say 15, and then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And then we'll basically just do the opposite of what we just did. So instead of setting the background color to the pending, we'll set it to the send color because they're now able to send a request again, and we'll set the text to send as well. So whenever a player sends a trade request, the button will display pending, and then after the cooldown has expired, then it will be reset to what it was originally. So now that we have that all set up, let's go ahead and actually comment out this if statement that we created right here and start up our game so that we can kind of see what a generated template looks like in case we missed anything. And I don't know how I missed this handler requirement statement up there, but go ahead and delete that, and then when you start your game, you should have no issues. So we can see when we pop into our game, our avatar has been generated, our name's right there, and the button is set to send as it should be by default. We can't test the button clicking because we actually need a server to respond to a remote function. Otherwise, we would test that right now as well. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to insert a local script inside of the trade request, and we'll rename this to manager. Then what we can do is we can actually copy some of our standard variables from our other manager scripts, like these ones right here, for instance. So we're going to get the player service, we'll get the replicated storage, we'll get the remotes folder, and then we'll also get the player variable as well. We also want to get the screen GUI and the frame. We don't actually need a container, but we will actually create a few more variables for this specific GUI right here. Local message equals frame.message. Local avatar equals frame.avatar, local accept equals frame.accept, and local exit button equals frame.exit button. So then what we'll do is we'll create a new function called display GUI, and this will accept the trader, which is actually going to be a player. So not us, it'll be the opposite player. And remember, the GUI that we're working on is this one right here. So a little notification will pop up whenever a player sends us a trade request. So what we want to do first is we want to enable the screen GUI so the player sees the notification. Then we need to set the avatar's image to the player's thumbnail. And remember, we do this by using a method inside of the player service. And the method is get user thumbnail async. And then we'll pass through that player's user ID. So trader.user ID, enum, headshot as the type, and 100 by 100 as the size. Then for the text of the message, we want to display the player.display name. And we want to combine that with another string. And that's going to be has sent you a trade request, exclamation mark. And now we're actually going to take this string and we're going to turn that into a static variable. So local message template equals has sent you a trade request, and then we can put the variable right there just in case we come back in the future. We can easily see what this string is for and we can modify it. Now that we have this function set up, we have to think about when do we actually want to call this. We're going to be using a remote event, and from the server, whenever a player sends out a trade request, it's going to go to the server, and then the server is going to see if the player can send a trade request to the other player, and then we'll fire a remote event telling the other player that they have just received a request. So we're going to need to create a new remote event in the remotes folder, and we're going to rename this to trade request received. So inside of the manager script, we're going to listen to the trade request received event, then .onClient event, and we're going to connect that to the display GUI function. Next, we'll script the exit button, so exit button mouse button one click, connect function, screen GUI enabled equals false. Simple as that. Now we also need to script the accept button as well. So we'll say accept mouse button one click, connect function, and what this would do is whenever we click this button, we of course want the screen GUI to not be enabled anymore because we don't want to be able to see it. And then what we also need to do is we need to use a remote event to tell the server that we've just accepted this trade request. So we'll go ahead and add a new remote inside of here, and this one's going to be called accept trade request. So back inside, whenever we click the accept button, what we're going to do is we're going to say remotes.accept trade request fire server. Now one thing is that we want to actually tell the server who we want to trade with or whose request we actually accepted in case multiple people send us request at once. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable up here, and that's going to be called trader. We're not going to set that to anything yet, but whenever we call the display GUI function, we're actually going to set the trader variable to the player that's sent to this function as well. And the reason that we're doing that is because we can then easily tell the server whose trade request we're accepting. So now that we've done all that work, what we now need to do is we actually need to create a server script for working with some of these remote events. So we're going to go into the server script service, and we'll add a brand new script to this. We'll rename this script to trade. And of course, inside of here, we're going to need the player service. So game get service players. We're also going to need the replicated storage as well. And then from the replicated storage, we're going to get the remotes. So we'll say local remotes equals replicated storage dot remotes. And now remember that send trade request remote function that we made? That's the first thing that we're going to work with. So we're going to say remotes dot send trade request dot on server invoke. And now we need to create a function up here. So that function is going to be called send trade request, and that's of course going to accept a player. This is going to be the person who sent it, and then the target ID. So a player's user ID that this player wants to trade with. So then we can set the onInvoke to this send trade request function just like that. Now inside this function, we'll create a variable for the actual target player, and we can get the player by using the player service and saying get player by user ID. So then we can pass through the target ID to that method, and then we should get returned a player. But if we don't get returned a player, then we just run a return end and stop the function right there. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to check if the player is on cooldown, because we don't want our players to get spammed with trade requests. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new function, and that's going to be called isOnCooldown, and that'll accept the player ID and the target ID as well, which both will be numbers. Now we're actually going to create a table so that we can easily keep track of what players have sent out requests to others and if they're trading and other things like that. So we'll create a new table, and this is going to be called Trade Requests, and that's going to be set to an empty table. Then what we're going to do is inside of the isOnCooldown function is we're going to create a variable called requests, and we're going to set that equal to trade request, and we're going to index that with the player ID. Now if this table doesn't actually exist, then we just want to return end, because that would mean that the player is not on cooldown. And now if the table does exist, we actually need to find the target's ID inside of that table. So we're going to say return table.find requests, and then we're going to look for the target ID. So if the target ID is found, then something will be returned through this function. So then we're going to say if is on cooldown, and we'll pass through the player.user ID and the target ID, then return end. So now that we know the player is not on cooldown, we can actually send out the invite. And what we need to do is we need to get the player's trade request table, similar to how we did in is on cooldown. So we're going to say local player table equals trade request and index that with the player.user ID. Now the reason that we need to do this is because we need to check if this first exists before we can actually add a player to this table. So then we're going to say if not player table. So if this table doesn't exist, then we actually just want to create the table. So we're just going to set that to a blank table. And then after we create that table, we then want to set the player table variable to this table right here. Then after we've done that, we're actually going to fire off our trade request received remote. So we're going to say fire client, and who we're going to fire this to is the target, and we're going to pass through the player who is saying to that client that they want to trade with them. Now we of course need to add this target to the player's list so that they can be on cooldown. So we're going to say table.insert player table, and we're going to pass through the target ID, and then we'll remove the player from the cooldown by saying task.delay, and of course remember, set this to however long your cooldown is. We'll just say 15 seconds, and we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say local index equals table.find trade requests and index that with the player.user ID, and we're going to try to find the target ID. And then we'll say table.remove trade requests, pass them the same variable, so trade request player.user ID, and we're going to remove the index from that table. So this will add their cooldown, and then after the cooldown ends, they will be removed from it. And then finally, we just need to return true so that we know this trade has been sent out successfully. One thing we have to touch up real quick, inside of the trade script, inside of the isOnCooldown function, we have to say actually if not requests. So if the player doesn't have any requests sent out, then we're going to return false because the player obviously wouldn't be on cooldown. We can then start this up, go into the trade menu, and we can see that we can send ourselves a trade request, and we can even see that the notification popped up down here as well. So now that we have all that working, the next thing that we actually need to do is start scripting up accepting the trade requests. And what I mean by this is inside of the manager, anytime we click on the accept button, we fire this accept trade request remote event right there. So what we're going to do is back inside of the trade script, we're going to say remotes.accept trade request on server event connect, and now we're going to create a new function for this. So we'll say local function accept trade request, and that's going to accept a player and a target ID as well, which is going to be a number. So then we can connect that event to that function right there. And what are we going to do inside this function? Well, something similar. We're actually going to get the target again from the target ID just to make sure that that player exists and is inside of our game. Now what we need to do is we actually need to check if either of the players are currently trading with another player, because if they are, then we don't want to start up any more trades or else things can go bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new function up here, and that'll be the top function, and it's going to be called isTrading, and it'll accept the player that we want to check if they're trading. Now the way that we're actually going to track if players are trading or not is by once again using another table. So we're going to say local trading equals and then a blank table. And now what we're going to do is to check if a player is trading is return trading and the player's user ID. So this will return if the player is in this table or not. So going back inside of the accept trade request function, we're going to say if is trading, and we'll pass through the player and the target. So if either of the players are trading, then what we want to do is we just run return end and stop the function right there. Now the next thing we need to check is if the player we're trying to trade with has sent us a request for us to accept. And the reason that we need to do this is because of exploiters. Exploiters could tell us that they're accepting another player's trade, but that player never actually sent them a trade request, and if we let that go through, then exploiters would be able to forcefully trade with all the other players on our server. So what we're going to do is create another function, and that's going to be called hasSentRequest. And what this is going to do is it's going to accept the acceptor's ID, which is of course going to be a number, and then the sender's ID, which is of course going to be a number as well. The way that we're going to be finding if a player has sent a request or not is going to be by using that trade request table that we created earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to say local request table equals trade request, and we're going to index that with the sender ID. Now, if the request table doesn't actually exist, then we're just going to return end right here, because that would mean that the player has not sent any requests. But now if that table does exist, then what we're going to do is we're going to say table.find, and inside of the request table, we're going to look for the acceptor's ID. And now if we're able to find that, then we're going to return true. Otherwise, if we get to the end of the function, we're just going to return false. So if we are able to find that player's name inside of the other player's request table, then we know that the request has been sent. So going back into our accept trade request function, we're going to say if not has sent request passed through the player.userID and the target ID, then return end. So now, if the target exists, if neither of the players are trading, and as long as the player has sent a request to the acceptor, then we can actually get these two players trading. So now let's add both of these players to the trading table. So we're going to say player.userID equals target ID, and then we'll also do the opposite for the target ID. So we're going to say trading equals target ID, and this equals player.userID. And now we're also going to create another remote event, and we'll rename this one to trade began. And now we're going to fire this remote event to both of the clients so that we can activate their GUI and get them into the trading mode. So we'll say remotes.tradeBegan, fire client. So we're going to pass through the player, and we're also going to give that player the target ID. And then we also need to call this for the target and pass through the player's user ID, just like that. And now this function is all done. Now that we've done all that, we can actually begin scripting the trade GUI itself. We're going to go into the trade GUI, and we're going to delete both the button and the handler scripts, and we'll only be left with the manager script. And once inside of here, we have to clean this up a little bit. So of course, we don't need the pets config or the pets model, nor do we need the handler. We will actually keep the container variable, but for the rest of the stuff, we can pretty much delete it all except for the template variable, and then we'll also delete all of this down here as well. Now, once we're left with all these variables, we have to create some more for a lot of the different components that are inside of our GUI. So we'll start off by making a variable for our title. That's going to be set to frame.title. Then we need to start making variables for all of the our components. So like our accepted, our label, our offer, our avatar, and then we'll also do the same for their components as well. So we'll say local our avatar equals frame.our_avatar, then our label, and we'll change the variable name once we get all the hours out of the way, then our offer, and finally our accepted. Now we'll just quickly rename the variables. Once we got all four of our variables, then we need to copy these, and we will replace our with their. So their avatar, their label, and their offer, and now we also need to rename the variables as well, and there we go. We've now got all of our and their components and variables as well. We could also put a little space between those two so that we can easily differentiate them. Now that we have all those components, we also need to get the accept button. So local accept equals frame.accept, and we also need to get the decline button as well. So frame.decline. Now remember, in our trade script, we fire the trade began remote whenever we want both of the players to begin trading. So we're going to need to actually listen to this remote in our script right here so that we can display the GUI and start doing the trading stuff. So we're going to say remotes.tradeBegan.onClientEvent connect. Now we'll actually create a function for handling this. So we're going to say local function begin trade, and that's going to accept the target ID, which is a number. So now whenever this function is called, we want to get the target from their target ID. So we're going to say local target equals players, get player by user ID, target ID, and of course, if not target, then return end. And now if we are able to get a target, what do we want to do? We want to enable the screen GUI so we can actually see that we're going to trade with another player. Now, before we enable the screen GUI, we also want to do a couple of things to sort of prepare our GUI as well. But what we can do first is we can connect the trade began remote to this function right here, and then we can create another function above this function, and this function will be called update labels. And that's going to accept a player, which is going to be our target. Now inside of this function, we want to modify the text of the title. And what do we want the title to say? We want it to say trade with, and then we wanted to display the players or the target's display name, just like that. But of course, we have to join them together using 2 periods, and now that will be good. Additionally, we need to modify some of their variables as well. So such as their label.text, we want that to be set to target.displayName, and we want to join that with '(s) offer. So this will display something like MonzterDEV's offer or something similar to that. And we also need to update their avatar image as well. And what are we going to set that to? Well, we're going to use the player service to get the player's thumbnail, and we're going to pass through the the target.userID, headshot as a thumbnail type, and we'll say 60 by 60 for the size. So now all that is good. What we then want to do is we want to call this function inside of our begin trade function and pass through the target. Now another thing that we need to consider is we need to actually modify or update our own labels as well when the script starts up so that it displays our own name, our avatar picture, and stuff like that. So what we'll do is towards the bottom of the script, we're going to create a new function, and this is going to be called startup. And inside of here, we're basically going to do the exact same thing that we did with their variables. So we're literally going to copy and paste these right down to here. Instead of their label, we'll say our label. And instead of their avatar, we'll say our avatar. And now, of course, we're going to use player.userID because we're our own player, and then player.displayName, just like that. And we'll just call the startup function right below it because we want the function to run as soon as the script starts up, and we only ever have to call this function one time. Now, another thing that we want to do is whenever we actually accept a trade and whenever our GUI is open, we want to generate all of the pets that are in our pet inventory and display them in our trade inventory as well. Now, we're actually going to go look back inside of our pet inventory GUI and look inside of the manager and the handler, and we're going to use some of the components from here to do exactly that. So for instance, if we look inside of the handler inside of the pet inventory, we have this module.generatePet function right here, which accepts a pet table, and then this is the function that we actually use to modify the template into a pet inside of our pet inventory. So now rather than making modifications to this specific method right here, we're just going to copy some of the main things that this function does, like all this stuff right here. Then back inside of the manager of our trade GUI, we'll create a brand new function called generate pet, and this will accept a pet table, which is of course going to be a pet table. We'll then paste the code from our pet handler script into here so that we can start working with it. Now the template that we're cloning is the template that is inside of our container right here, and this template is literally the exact same template that is inside of the pet inventory. So all the children that are inside of this template are literally the exact same, so we really don't have to modify too many things here. What we do need to change is we need to replace pet with pet table, as that's the new variable name, so we're just going to do that. We also need to create a pet models variable, and we can grab that directly from this handler right here. So let's go ahead and grab that variable and we'll put it right here. And now we also need to get this module as well, which we actually can do that easily. We'll go back to the top and we'll say local pets handler equals require script.parent.pet inventory.handler. And now we can actually use that when we need to. So we'll go back down to the function, and instead of saying module.generate viewport frame, we'll say pet handler.generate viewport frame. And finally, at the end of this function, we want to return the clone so that we can make some more modifications to it in another function. Now we'll call this function every single time we want to generate a brand new pet, if that's for our own pets or for the player that we're trading with as well. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually generate all of our own pets. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function, local function generate pets, and this is referring to our own pets. So you could even rename this to generate our pets or something like that. That'll probably make it less confusing. And now if we look at the manager that's inside of our pet inventory, how do we generate our own pets? Well, we go inside of the player, inside of the player's pet inventory folder, and then we get the children. And then we use this pet instance to table method, and we get a pet table, and then we also call the generate pet method from the handler as well. And that's how we generate the pets for our pet inventory GUI. So we can literally just copy this, go back inside of our manager, inside of this function, so for_pet in ipairs player.pet inventory get children do. Then we'll create a variable for the pet table, and instead of saying handler, we'll say pets handler, and then we've got the pet table from the instance. And now instead of calling pet handler.generate pet, we'll call the generate pet function that we just created. Now one thing that we also need to do inside of the generate pet function is we actually need to return the clone so that we can use that clone inside of this function right here. So say local pet equals generate pet, pass through the pet table, and there we go. And now the reason that we're getting the pet returned back to us is because we actually need to listen for when the pet is actually clicked on, because then we need to perform a specific action on it. We're not going to get too deep into that yet. I just wanted to make sure that we generate all the pets so that it populates our trade GUI and we can actually see all the pets that we're able to trade with. Anyways, we need to make sure that we call the generate our pets function whenever we actually start the trade. So before we even update the labels, we will generate our pets just like that. Now another thing that we need to think about is that considering we're generating the pets every single time we start a trade, we need to make sure that we actually clear out all of the pets anytime the trade ends. Otherwise, we're going to have a memory leak and we're going to have way more pets displayed inside of our trade GUI than we actually own. So let's go ahead and create a brand new function towards the top of our script, and this is going to be called cleanup. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to loop through each of the different containers. So for instance, we're going to loop through this container, we're going to loop through our offer and their offer, because all three of these variables are places that pets can be stored. Because remember, by default, our pets are in our container. Whenever we click on a pet inside of our container, we want to put that into our offer so the player sees the pet. And if a player selects any of their pets for trade, it'll go into their offer as well. And every single time a trade ends, we always want to make sure that we clean all these containers out and there's no pets in there, so that when the GUI is displayed next time, we won't see any pets there. So we'll first loop through our offer. So we're going to say for_child in ipairs our offer get children do. And then we want to want to check if the child is a text button, then we're just going to destroy it. So then we can copy and paste this for loop, and we're going to do the exact same thing for their offer. Then we can copy and paste it again, and we're going to do something similar for the container, but we have to modify it slightly. So we're going to check if the child is a text button and child.visible. So this would mean that the child is visible. And the reason that we're doing that is because we don't want to delete this default template right here, because we need that so that we can create clones of it. And this template should never be visible anyway, because it's the default one. So going through this loop, it'll only delete all the visible ones, which would be the clones of it. Now, the next thing to think about is, when are we actually going to call this cleanup function? Well, we would call it whenever we actually click on the decline button. So we're going to go towards the bottom of our script, and we'll add the decline button. So decline.mouse button, one click, connect, function. And now whenever we click the decline button, we should actually use a remote event to communicate with the server and tell the server, hey, we no longer want to trade. We've just declined the trade. So we're going to go back into our replicated storage inside of remote folder and add a brand new remote event. And we'll rename this to trade declined. So then whenever we click on the decline button, we're going to say remotes.trade declined fire server. And now that we've declined it, we'll then call our cleanup function, and we'll disable the screen GUI. So screen GUI.enabled equals false, so that we no longer see it. Now, before we're actually able to start testing some of this stuff out, we need to go back inside of the trade request GUI inside of the manager. And when we fire the accept trade request remote event, instead of passing through the trader, we actually need to pass through the trader.user ID, because inside of our trade script, we are looking for the target ID and not actually the target player. And now that we have that all good, we should be able to test this out. So sending a trade with myself and then accepting it, we can see that this pops up and we are trading with ourselves. So we have 2 of my avatars right here and 2 of my names displayed with offer as well. Now, no pets are being displayed in the GUI, but I'm pretty sure that's because we don't have any pets as is. So what I'll do real quick is I'll hatch a couple of pets. So now that we have pets, when we actually go to trade with ourselves and we accept the trade, our pets are displayed. Now, it clearly shows 2 times the normal amount of pets that we actually have. The reason for this is because we're trading with ourselves. So inside of our trade script, when we fire off the trade began remote event, we're firing this to ourselves twice because we're both the player and the target. That's why there are 2 rows of these pets. So remember, this is all just for testing, but this means that it is working as it should be, which is good. Additionally, we've partially scripted the decline button, so let's go ahead and click that and see if that works. And it seems like it does work. It most likely fires off the remote event that we haven't actually tracked on the server yet, and it also does hide the GUI as well, which means that things are going good. Now, with that trade decline remote event that we just created, let's go back over to the server and start scripting this remote event out. First things first, down here we actually need to get the remote. So remotes.tradeDecline.onServerEvent connect, and then we'll connect that to a function. Let's go ahead and create that brand new function up here. So local function trade declined, and this is going to accept a player. So then we can connect that event to that function right there. And now looking back at our isTrading function, isTrading will actually return a value, which will be the target that the player is currently trading with if they're trading with any player at all. And that's how we can actually get who a player is trading with by just their player alone. So we're going to say local target ID equals isTrading, and we're going to pass through our player. Now, if we don't get any target ID returned to us, then that means that this player isn't actually trading with anybody, so we'll just stop the function right there. But if we do get a target ID returned to us, then we also want to get that specific player as well. So local target equals players, get player by user ID, and pass through the target ID. Now we need to index the trading table with the player.user ID, and we're going to set that to nil so that we know that this player is no longer trading with anybody. And we also need to do the same thing as well for the target. So we're going to say target ID and then set that to nil as well. And then finally, we'll use the trade decline remote, and we're going to actually fire client, and we're going to send that to the target, and we'll pass through the player.user ID to that remote as well. And also, we're only going to do this if we actually find the target. So if target then we will call that remote just like that. So now we need to go back inside of our manager script right here, and we need to listen for that remote event to be fired. So we're going to say remotes.tradeDeclined.onClientEvent connect, and we're going to connect that to a brand new function. So let's go ahead and create that function right here. So local function decline, and inside of this function, we're actually going to call the cleanup function, and we're going to say screen GUI.enabled equals false because we don't want them to see it anymore, similar to exactly like what we do down here. So we can delete these 2 lines of code, and we can just call this decline function right here, just like that. And also, whenever this trade decline remote is fired, we can also call the decline function as well, just like that. So now, whenever we decline a trade, we're going to tell the server, hey, we just declined a trade, and then we're going to clean this up and hide the GUI. And now from the server side, if a player that we're trading with declines the trade, then they're going to tell the server, and then the server is going to tell us. So then if we're told that the other player has declined the trade, then we're going to call this decline function right here, clean up the GUI, and then hide it as well. The next thing we're going to be working on is selecting specific pets. Whenever we click on a pet that is stored within inside of the container variable, we want to put that pet inside of our offer, which is another container. And now if we click on a pet that's already inside of our offer, we want to put that pet back inside of the container because we would effectively be unselecting or selecting the pet based on their location. So we're going to go back to our generate our pets function. Now inside of here, we have a variable which is pet, and that's actually the clone of the template returned back to us. So that would be a text button. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a set attribute method on this text button, and the attribute that we're going to be setting is called selected. And by default, we're going to set that to false because when we first generate the pets, they're not automatically selected by default. Now, whenever we click on a pet, we can then use this attribute to see if this pet is selected, and if it is selected, then we obviously want to unselect it, or if it's not selected, then we obviously want to select it. So we're going to say if pet get attribute selected then. So if the pet is selected, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to deselect it, else select it. So what does deselecting and selecting entail? Let's first work on selecting a pet. When we select a pet, what do we want to do? Well, we want to actually set its attribute of selected to be true so that we know that it's selected now. And we also want to set the parent of this text button to our offer because this is a pet that we've now selected to be traded to the other player. Additionally, we're going to need to use another remote event. So we'll go inside of a remotes folder, and this remote event is going to be called Trade Select Pet. So we'll then call that remote. So Trade Select Pet, fire server, and we're going to fire it with the pet table.uuid. So we're going to tell the server, hey, this is the UUID of one of our pets that we want to trade. And then from the server, we're going to tell the other player that this is the pet that the other player wants to trade with you. Now we finished everything for the selecting, so that's all handled perfectly. What we can do to make this a little bit easier to understand later in the future if we ever come back to this script is we'll actually create a function for this. So we'll say local function select pet, and the arguments that we're going to need to get passed through to here is the button, which is of course going to be a text button, and the pet table, which is of course going to be that pet table that we've normally been getting. And now we'll just take all of this and put that directly into here. And now instead of saying pet, we are going to say button, just like that. And then we're going to use the pet table as normal. So then we just call the select pet function right here, and we can pass through the pet, which is going to be the text button, and the pet table, which is of course going to be the pet table, just like that. So now we can basically copy and paste this select pet function, and we can rename this from select pet to deselect pet. And we're basically just going to do the opposite. So instead of setting this attribute to true, we're actually going to set it to false. Instead of setting the parent of the button to our offer, we're going to set it back to the container. And then instead of firing off this remote, we're actually going to create another remote, and we're going to rename this from select to deselect. So then we'll fire off the trade deselect pet, and that'll once again be with the UUID. And now we have to actually call this function right here. So deselect pet with the pet and the pet table, just like that. Now we can go into our game and test this out. So we're going to go ahead and accept our own trade. And then let's go ahead and say, for instance, click on the bunny. Now that we see that we've clicked on the bunny is now inside of our offer. If we click on that bunny again, it is now removed from our offer exactly as it should be. So we can click a couple of different pets. We can see they fill inside of this container. And if we click them again, we are unselecting them, which means this is working perfectly. Now let's go back over to the server script and start working on the server side of this stuff. Now we have another remote to work with. So we're going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to say trade select pet instead of the trade decline. And we're going to connect that to a brand new function. And let's go ahead and start creating this function. So local function trade select pet. Of course, the first argument is going to be a player, and the second one is going to be the UUID of the pet, which is going to be a string. Now we're going to copy some of our standard variables like this target ID right here, and then also getting the target. So first of all, we need to check if the player is trading with somebody, and then also get the target as well. And if we're not able to find a target, then we just want to return end because that player is no longer in the game. The next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the player actually owns the pet of the UUID that they're telling us that they want to trade. So we're going to say local pet instance equals player, and we can access this by going into their pet inventory, and then we're going to say find first child, and the name of the child is going to be the UUID that the player passed to us. So if not pet instance, then return end because the player does not actually own that pet. We then need to convert the information from the pet instance into a table, which we call a pet table. Now, if you don't remember exactly how we do this, we can go inside of our script, and we want to go inside of the pet handler because inside of the pet handler, we have this pet instance to table function, and this is all we do. Now, since this script is on the client side, we can't actually use this on the server side. So all we're going to do is we're just going to copy this, bring it into the trade script, paste it just like this, and now we can modify it slightly. So we need the UUID, we need the ID, and we need the rarity, but we actually don't care about it being equipped or not. And then instead of the pet variable, it's actually the pet instance variable. So just like that. And now we have the UUID, the ID, and the rarity all inside of this new pet table right there. And we'll actually rename this from new pet to pet table. There we go. And now back at the top of our script, we're going to create a new table so that we can track all the pets that the player has selected. So we're going to say local trade selected equals blank table. Now going back inside of the trade select pet function, we're going to say local selected pets equals trade selected. And we're going to index that with the player.user ID. And now if not selected selected pets. So if the player doesn't have any selected pets currently, what we'll do is we'll create a table for that player. So we're going to say trade selected indexed out the player.user ID equals a brand new table. And then we're going to say table.insert trade selected indexing that with the player.user ID. And then we'll just add the UUID to this so that we can keep track of all the UUIDs of the pets that each player has selected when they're trading. Then finally, we'll use the remotes.trade select pet and fire that to the target with the pet table that we just created. So that means we have to go back inside of our manager script and listen to whenever this remote event is fired. So we're going to say remotes.trade select pet on client event, and now we actually have to do something. And what are we going to do? Well, we'll go under the generate our pets function, and we're going to say local function trader selects pet. And what are we going to get? We are going to get the pet table. Then what are we going to do? We're actually just going to call the generate pet function, and we're going to pass through the pet table. Now we need to modify this function slightly. The reason for that is because inside of this function, we are setting the parent right here to container. And of course, if a trader selects the pet, we don't want the parent to be the container. We want the parent of that pet to be their offer. So what we need to do is inside of the generate pet function, we need to accept another argument, and that's going to be an instance. So now instead of setting the parent to container by default, we're going to set that to the parent argument, which is passed to this function. So now we got to make sure that every single time we call this function, we pass through the correct parent. So originally inside of our generate our pets function, we always wanted this parented to the container. So we're going to need to make sure that we pass that through in this argument. And now inside of the trader selects pet function, we're going to need to also pass through a parent as well, and that's going to be for their offer. So then we're going to go ahead and connect the trade selected pet remote event to this function right here. Next, we have to start scripting the deselect pet on the server side as well. So going back to the server, we also need to make sure that we point the trade select pet remote event at the trade select pet function that we just created, and then we can add the new remote event. Instead of select, it's deselect pet. So then we're going to create another function, local function trade deselect pet, and that'll accept a player and a UUID as a string. And now let's make sure that we hook that event to that function just like that. And we're going to copy a lot of the basic variables that we created in our trade select pet function just like that. We're also going to get the selected pets as well. So we're going to say local selected pets equals trade selected indexed out the player.user ID. And if we don't find any selected pets from that player, then we just want to return n because they can't deselect any pets if they don't have any pets selected, right? So now that we've done that, we should be able to actually find the pet. So we're going to say local pet equals, and then we're going to say table.find, and we're going to look inside of the selected pets table, and we're going to search for the UUID that the player has passed to us. Now, if we're not able to actually find the pet, then we're going to return n because that means that the player doesn't have that pet selected. But if we are able to find that pet, then what we're going to do is we're going to say table.remove, and we're going to remove it from the selected pets, and we're going to remove pet. Now that we've removed that pet from that table, we also need to notify the other player as well. So we're going to say local trade deselect pet fire client target UUID. So we're going to remove that pet from the server table, and we're also going to tell the client so that they can remove it from their GUI as well. So going back inside of the manager, we now need to handle the trader deselect pet. So we're going to go back down to here and add the new remote event. So trade deselect pet, and we'll create a function just below this one right here. So trader select pet to trader deselect pet, and then let's make sure that we set this function to that remote event just like that. And now what do we want to do whenever a player deselects a pet? Well, we simply want to delete that pet from their container. So we're going to say local instance equals their offer find first child. Oh, and also we get past the UUID to this function. So we're going to look for the UUID, and if that instance exists, then what we're going to do is we are going to destroy it. And it's as simple as that. So now we can start testing some more complex things, and we're actually going to want to launch 2 different clients so that we can simulate players trading with each other, because of course you need 2 players to do that. If you guys are unfamiliar with how to launch multiple clients in Studio, what you're going to do is you're going to go to test, and inside of here you have local server. Make sure you click on that, and then you can select the amount of clients that you actually want to launch. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 8. Now we're going to set that to 2, and then you can either hit F7 or click this start button right here. The hotkey is F7, and then wait for it to fire up. Now after it does fire up, you'll actually have 3 different screens open. This one in front is actually from the server side, so we can see 2 things on the server have been printed, while these 2 are their own client. Now we're going to go ahead and test out trading with them, so we're going to go ahead and send a trade request, and we can see the trade request does actually appear. There is no thumbnail though, because these players aren't actually real players. As we can see, their name is player, so whenever we use the get thumbnail method on it, these players don't actually exist, so they don't have a thumbnail. Anyways though, we can go ahead and accept that trade. Now we can see that we are trading with that player, and then let's go ahead and select the pet. And when we select the pet on this side, we can see that it's also selected on this side as well, which means that this is working perfectly. Now if we deselect this pet, we can also see that it's removed on this player's side of the screen as well, so we are seeing accurate trades working in action, which means this is working perfectly currently. The next thing we need to work on is accepting a trade. So let's go towards the bottom of our script. accept. Right where we listen for the decline button to be clicked, let's go ahead and listen for the accept button to be clicked. Now the accept button actually needs to perform of one of two actions. If we've already clicked the accept button, the text will actually change to display unaccept, and if the button displays unaccept, we need to perform a different action than if it displays accept. So we'll say if accept.text equals accept, then. And what do we want to do? Well, we actually need to tell the server that we accept this trade. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new remote event, and we're going to say trade accept. So then we're going to say remotes.trade accept fire server. And then we're going to need to modify our accepted, which is going to be a text label, and we need to set the visibility of that to true. We also want to modify the text of the accept button from accept to unaccept. And now that's all good. Now, what happens if we actually want to unaccept the trade? Well, we'll basically do the opposite of what we just did here. So we can go ahead and copy and paste this. And then we're also going to create another remote. Instead of saying trade accept, we're going to say trade unaccept. So we'll fire off the trade unaccept remote just like that. We'll set the visibility of our accepted to false. And then the text should not be unaccept. It should now display accept. Now, one thing that we also need to consider is imagine if two players put a bunch of pets up for trade and one of them clicked accept. Now, imagine if the other player who hasn't accepted yet starts taking out all of their pets that they were about to trade and quickly clicks the accept button before the other player realizes this. Well, then the other player would basically feel scammed because they didn't realize that another player could remove all their pets and they would still be accepted. So what I'm effectively saying is that anytime we actually select or deselect a pet, we most likely want to perform this unaccept action right here as well. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to make this into its own function. So we're going to take these actions and we're going to put it towards the top of our script. So above cleanup, we're going to say local function unaccept trade, and then we'll just paste those actions right there. Now inside of the generate our pets function, whenever we listen for the pet to be clicked on, we want to call the unaccept trade function as well, just like that. And then back inside of when we're listening for the accept button to be clicked on, we want to call the unaccept trade and the else statement as well. So with all that being done, we can hop directly into the game and start testing out our trading system. We can click on the trade button, send the other player a trade request. We can go over here and accept that trade request, and now we have this GUI popping up. And then we can select any of our pets that we want to throw up for trading, and we can select some from over here as well. And then if we both hit on accept, we can see that the trade has been accepted. So it looks like this whole system is working perfectly. With all that being said, we now have a functioning trade system in our game. Now, as always, if this video did help you guys out or you did enjoy it, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Of course, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and to get access to all the games and the scripts that I made during this video. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys are going to check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.